Well, all right, everybody. I think I hear the Breslin striking 4 o'clock, so I want to get started. But I'm Susan Askew, and I am so excited that you guys are all here. And I'm really grateful that you are helping launch this book club program. This is only the second one we've had, and what a rock star we have today. So the way this is going to work, since we've one, and it was with Kevin Wilson and his book, Nothing to See Here, and that was really fun. But we set that up as a webinar, and the feedback I got was, we miss seeing everybody. And so we're setting this one up as a meeting through Zoom so that you can see everybody who's using the video, and we can actually talk to each other. Now, having said that, I have the power to mute everybody, and so I will do that so that there's not any disruptions while our special guest is discussing the book with us. But so we do want to be able to take questions, though. If you can see on my screen down at the bottom is the chat feature, and you can type your questions there, and then we will, when we come to the time to start asking questions, I'll go to those questions and pose them to John so he doesn't have to try to read them. But, you know, it's an exciting time on campus right now, and I'd love to give you a big Sewanee update, but that's for a different venue. But we did have the transition of our vice chancellors this week, and it was pretty meaningful and emotional, and our new Vice Chancellor, Ruben Brigady, is off to the races. Yesterday was his first day, and we feel like we are in good hands during this time. So we are looking forward to learning more about his plans for Sewanee, and it's just really, really an exciting time. So now we're going to get started with the book, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. And I know most of you all know who our speaker is, but I want to just give a little background just to remind you all. But he came to Sewanee. He was in the English department for almost 50 years. And when he arrived with that first class of women. So he came in 1969. And so I think he has a special kindred relationship with that first class of women and those early women at Sewanee. But he went to Notre Dame, and then he got his master's and PhD in Virginia before he came here to Sewanee. And I mentioned he was in the English department. Also he was the director of summer school for many, many years while he was here. He was so popular among his peers. They honored him with the Sewanee Society of Scholars for the best teaching practices the faculty members give to one of their own. And then his former students got together, and they gave him, I think, the ultimate compliment by naming the Reishman room in Gaylor Hall. And many of you know him so well, and you know that he uses his initials a lot, and those JVR initials are almost as recognizable as YSR and EQB. So anyway, and the other image you think of is him riding on his bicycle, and it just brings joy to everybody who sees him. But he is sitting here in the McGriff Alumni House with me. He's in the lobby, and I'm in my office, so we could be distant. But he is sitting in the lobby, and in front of him is his beautiful portrait that, again, alums gave as a gift in his honor, and it gets to hang here in McGriff Alumni House. And then behind him, which is the old party room in the Phi House, we have all these plaques, and his name is on that plaque behind him for receiving the Distinguished Faculty Award in 2015. So anyway, I hope he feels very comfortable where he is. And I'm going to turn it over to him. And he is going to talk about our book and open it up for some discussion. So everybody, please welcome John Reishman.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be talking to you in this strange new way. I will say by way of introduction that this is the first time I've ever tried to do this. And Claire told me to look straight at the camera. So I'll try to do that, but every now and then I'll have to look down for reassurance from my notes and so forth. I'd like to begin by talking about a few dates that I think will, if you can appreciate the significance of these dates, enhance the characters and the plot in Joseph Conrad's Secret Agent. The first date is the date of publication. Conrad published The Secret Agent in 1907. 7 years later was the outbreak of the First World War. And we can see a kind of prophetic anticipation of that war in the plot of this novel. Another date that I'd like to mention to you is 1814, which is the date when the Congress of Vienna was called together in order to draft a treaty that would put Europe back together after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic conquests. The map of Europe had been changed dramatically. And I think it's also interesting that although it was in the next year that that Congress drafted the treaty, it was 100 years later that the solution that they arrived at was breaking up. And the novel that we're talking about is set in anticipation, in a world anticipating the problems that would result in the First World War. Stevie, the brother of Winnie Verloc in the novel, says it's a bad world for poor people. And the question that I would like to try to consider today is, how does that apply to the lives of all of the characters who are struggling to realize their own fulfillment and identity in the world that Stevie intuitively understands to be a bad world for poor people? And I think what we'll see is that that doesn't mean simply the economically disadvantaged. It's a bad world for people, all people who are in some sense poor people. The other date that I would like you to consider is the 1945 and the end of World War II, because in some ways the world that was put together again by Europe and by the United States and by other powers is the world that we have inherited. And it seems to me that in some ways, like the world that we see in this novel, it too may be in some ways coming apart. The center, to use Yeats's phrase, doesn't seem able to hold. And there are alarming symptoms that seem to indicate that this synthesis that was arrived at after the Second World War, like the synthesis that was arrived at after the Congress of Vienna, is coming apart. So I'd like you to think about that in the context of my discussion of the characters in the novel and the plot in which they're involved. The central character, I think, in the novel, the character whose life reflects the most dramatic indication of what Conrad means to say about the world, is Winnie Verloc. And I'd like to just summarize a bit about Winnie's situation as the novel opens. Winnie is an orphan. Winnie's father has died. He was a rather cruel and harsh man and has left Winnie and her retarded brother Stevie and her mother to shift for themselves in this world that Stevie is coming to realize is a bad world. Winnie, in her youth, is an attractive woman, full-figured, we're told, and she has beautiful hair. And she develops a relationship with a butcher's son that has many romantic dimensions to it, but suddenly she realizes that the butcher's son is not going to be able to supply her with the support she needs for her mother and her brother. And so she sacrifices that romantic relationship and marries Verloc, who is one of the occupants of a series of apartments that her mother has instituted in order to provide a temporary living for the family after her husband's death. So Winnie believes that Stevie is worth every sacrifice she can make. Winnie is a lover, and her mother is also a lover. And she loves Stevie, and she is willing to do anything she can to sustain his very fragile life in this bad world. And so she approves of her daughter marrying one of the tenants of these apartments that she runs, Adolphe Verloc. Now let's stop just for a minute and think about Verloc. Verloc is a young man. He's of French and English origin, enlists in the French army, and as a result has access to a secret about a new gun that they are able to manufacture. And he realizes that he can raise money by selling this secret to agents of other governments. And he does this. He does it in order to provide for a romantic attraction that he has experienced. And what he finds is that the romantic attraction betrays him to the police for the money he's made. She secures that money, and he's put in jail for 5 years. So both Winnie and Verloc, in some sense, have an early realization that romance somehow doesn't work out in the world that they're confronting. So Verloc then engages in becoming an agent for a foreign power and communicates information about the anarchist group that he's involved in, and to both the police and to this foreign embassy. The symbol for Verloc as secret agent is a triangle, and there's an irony, a delta. There's an irony in that because the 3 points represent Verloc's contacts with both the foreign embassies and the established government and its officials in England. So everybody knows what the secret agent is about, and the secret agent isn't really secret at all. He marries Winnie and takes her home. Home is a small square house with a store in the front from which Verloc dispenses pornography. It's cheap and bad pornography, but it serves as a kind of front for his activities as a secret agent. Between the profits from the store, which are minimal, and from the tipping off the foreign embassy about his information, Verloc makes a living. And Winnie is willing to settle for that living as the only reward in her life, which will allow her to sustain the life of Stevie, her brother. So again, so far we've talked about Verloc and about Stevie and about Winnie. But the difference, I think, in Verloc from Winnie at this moment is that Verloc thinks that he has finally assembled a world that for him is totally comfortable and requires no real effort. Verloc and several of the other characters are notably fat, and they are capable of only very limited activity. So Verloc is happy in this situation. And as chapter 1 begins, he leaves his shop and house and leaves Winnie behind with Stevie and her mother in the house and goes off to the foreign embassy to which he has been summoned. Now, the foreign embassy, for 11 years of Verloc's experience, has been in charge of an old-style Germanic Austrian diplomat, Baron Stott Wertenheim. And the thing about the Baron is that he represents a kind of last gasp of the Congress of Vienna's solution through diplomatic negotiation and so forth to maintain the peace of Europe. And Verloc, ironically, is his ally in this. And as he goes forward to meet the new man who is in charge of the embassy, he anticipates that this is going to keep going. What he finds, however, is that Vladimir, the new first secretary of the embassy, is going to require of him an act of terror. Vladimir is convinced, in spite of his friendly associations with the British officials and with some of the elegant population, Vladimir is determined to impose on Britain, or for Britain to impose upon itself, a kind of tightening up of the order, which is what he and his fellow Europeans are interested in doing in the Milan conference. And so Verloc is told, first of all, that his performance is lackluster and unsatisfactory, and then that in order to enhance his worth to this embassy, he must blow up the Greenwich Observatory. Vladimir reasons that science is and reason, which the observatory represents, are the hallmarks of British belief and in progress and in maintaining social and political order. And so he thinks this is going to create a great shock. Verloc is crushed. This places him in danger. It also places him in a situation which could upset the whole world that he has so carefully constructed in order to accommodate his own comfort. He returns home, and Winnie is talking to him about the day, and her concerns are about her brother Stevie, and Verloc's concerns are about this new terrible burden that's been placed on him. Verloc has no capacity to appreciate Winnie's love for her brother, nor does he have any way of returning love to her. That is to say, he doesn't think any of that really matters as long as this bourgeois stability is maintained in the immediate house, which gives him comfort. So comfort is Verloc's whole effort. And what he finds is that it is becoming suddenly increasingly difficult for him to do so. He calls a meeting of his fellow anarchists. Now, these anarchists represent a group of those who are in some way or another very much opposed to the establishment order and determined to destroy it. With one exception, their efforts are totally in vain. That is to say, they are old. Michaelis, who is described as the ticket of leave apostle, is a man who has been jailed periodically, but is at the same time on probation. That's what a ticket of leave involves. And he has been in solitary confinement for years at one time, and has decided that the social and economic order will gradually destroy itself without any kind of effort required. So he has, in some sense, because of his lack of terrorist involvement, been accepted by the group. but is not admired because he doesn't want to do anything to make the world different. Carl Jung is an old and sick and helpless revolutionary who's unwilling to do anything because of his ill health that requires any amount of effort. Instead, he dreams of a world of violence where the weak destroy the strong and create an order of supermen, which is, of course, an anticipation of the Third Reich and its activities. What Verloc realizes, though, at this meeting is that none of these people is going to be able to assist him in this task. And so he hits upon a solution. He watches Stevie, and it hasn't occurred to him before that he has to support Stevie and Winnie's mother, as well as Winnie, and that this boy has absolutely no practical use at all. Stevie has failed repeatedly, you'll notice, to involve himself in the economic order. Each time he tries, some aspect of the cruelty of that economic order dawns on him, and he begins to protest in various ways. His first office job, he ends by throwing firecrackers all around and destroying a world that he thinks has been unkind to one of his fellow workers. So Stevie is of no use, and Verloc suddenly sees that it could be Stevie who could take the explosives that he will buy from a man called the Professor, and that will be the way of blowing up the observatory without involving himself in any danger at all. Winnie, in the meantime, believes that everything is coming up roses in the world that she has sacrificed to create for Stevie. She has no idea, of course, that Verloc has these designs on him. And so Winnie is looking at Verloc and Stevie and seeing develop between them a relationship which she says at one point is like the relationship between a father and a son. But of course, it is not like the relationship between a father and a son, because what Verloc is doing is preparing Stevie to take the explosives to the observatory in Greenwich and blow it sky high. The next point that I'd like to make about Stevie is that he is willing to go along with Verloc, which of course he has no understanding at all of what he's being trained to do. And Verloc explains that he's taking him out in the country to Michaelis's house, which has been given to him by a lady. And he's moving out of London and into this peaceful place, which delights Stevie because it gets him out of that obviously bad world and associates him with this impotent visionary, Michaelis. Well, at any rate, the next group of people that I'd like to consider as this plot develops are the Assistant Commissioner, Sir Ethelred, the parliamentarian at the top of the social and political heap, the great lady who entertains all of these people, including Vladimir in her salon, and the Chief Inspector Heat. Let's begin with Heat. Heat is aware that all of this activity by the anarchists is under careful scrutiny by him. He's aware of what they're up to. He also is quite aware of the balance of power, which is in some ways analogous to that assumption about the balance of power that characterized the Congress of Vienna and characterized the negotiations among the Allies after the Second World War. It's a delicate balance, but one that he is very proud of maintaining. His service is not his service to his government is not based on any kind of ideal of preserving it for the good order that it represents. It's a kind of game in which he's involved in maintaining this balance with the criminal element, and he likes to be the player in the game who can most perfectly manage it and keep this delicate balance that allows for peaceful activity to persist. So he's very upset when he finds out what has actually happened at Greenwich. Verloc has acquired from a figure named the Professor, who, by the way, always wires himself so that he can blow himself up at any moment. The police might move in on him. And this is what keeps him safe and what keeps his safe in the status quo. But at any rate, the assistant commissioner is determined that he will find out about this strange phenomenon at Greenwich, this unexpected and unanticipated by him event of terror. He doesn't like it at all. What he finds when he inspects the grounds is that the person who actually blew up stumbled and blew himself up before he arrived at the Greenwich Observatory. Stevie has been sacrificed to Verloc's cowardice and ambition. Stevie has also left behind a name tape which Winnie has sewn into his garment and that identifies him as the victim of this violent moment in Greenwich Park. Verloc, of course, who is at first suspected to be the victim of the explosion, is safe because he has sent Stevie on his way and avoided the explosion totally himself. So Inspector Heat knows this, and he goes for a discussion with his superior, the assistant commissioner. And the assistant commissioner learns that the chief inspector, Heat, knows what's gone on with this terrorist group and has monitored their activities and can even predict who it is who has been involved in this situation, because he knows about Verloc and Stevie, and he tells, finally, the assistant commissioner, well, I know who this person is who's responsible for this, and shows the name tag, and the assistant commissioner suddenly decides in his own self-serving, ambitious way that he is going to take over the investigation and report to Sir Ethelred, the parliamentarian, who can refer then to the national government as a whole and report on this disruptive incident. So again, the self-serving of Heat, the self-serving of the assistant commissioner, and finally, we meet Sir Ethelred. First, we're introduced to Sir Ethelred by his unpaid secretary, a man named Doodles, who is a young man of good birth and little talent, who is willing to do whatever it takes to have a fringe activity in the life of this parliamentarian. But Sir Ethelred is also totally indifferent to what has occurred. All he wants is power. And in order to achieve that power, he is sponsoring a bill which is of no great importance, but which will seem to mean that he is an efficient legislator and parliamentarian. Sir Ethelred's constant refrain is no details, which, of course, the assistant commissioner is dying to reveal to show his own competence. At any rate, the whole network of the establishment and the situation which is intended to protect the establishment is caught up in self-serving. The group meet occasionally, and this is interesting because Vladimir, the one who has dictated the blowing up of the Greenwich Observatory and therefore the death of Stevie. Vladimir is a member of this great lady's salon, and they all meet there, each understanding what the other is doing, and the great lady herself invites even Michaelis to the group. It's a sort of radical chic, like in the 60s when people on Park and Madison Avenue invited dissident elements to their cocktail parties and rejoiced in their ability to incorporate the whole spectrum of society in their polite and elegant environment. But again, underneath, everything is at war, even within the salon. And we see that self-interest, which prevails in every other segment of this society, is also very much at work there. Well, once the crime has been figured out by particularly Heat goes to Verloc to confront him with this disruptive moment in society and to warn him that his position and his freedom depend upon his willingness to subordinate his activities to what Heat considers to be the good of the establishment. But in the conversation with Verloc, Heat reveals and Verloc responds to the fact that he has sent Stevie to his death. And Winnie listens with horror to what Verloc confesses in a kind of blithe way to having eliminated Stevie, her brother, for whom she has sacrificed everything. And Winnie is transformed at this moment. And two characters that are rather disconnected in terms of history, but that I think bear much resemblance to Winnie, come to mind. The first is Tess of the D'Urbervilles, who in the economic issues of her day and the problems of her particular place in that economy, marries a man that she does not love in order to save the welfare of her family, who depend upon him for the money to survive. And finally, she realizes in a moment of freedom that the lover, Angel Clare, whom she truly loved, is still alive, and in her revolt against all that the social and economic order has done to her, she stabs her the husband that she has taken only for the welfare of her family, and goes for a brief time on a kind of wonderful honeymoon with Angel Clare, the man she really loves. The other figure I'd like you to think about is Aeschylus's Clytemnestra. Remember, Clytemnestra has naively believed that Agamemnon has arranged a marriage with a great Greek hero, Achilles, and so sends her daughter to Aulis in order to prepare her for this marriage. But the problem at Aulis is that Agamemnon's military alliance has been stymied because the winds won't blow to send their boats to Troy. Artemis requires of him that he sacrifice Iphigenia, his daughter, to his military ambitions. And he does so, and the winds blow. And word gets back to Clytemnestra that her daughter, rather than having this wonderful marriage, is in fact the victim of her father's ambition. And so for 10 years, she waits in Aeschylus's play, and finally lures him into the bath with this intense welcome and kills him. Each of these acts of violence is a moment, if you will, of liberation, when the social restraints and the economic restraints suddenly have been released from these women, and they can act in accord with their deepest impulses, with their deepest feminine impulses, in an act of violence. And Winnie plans the same thing. Verloc goes briefly to the continent to see if there's any help for him there in the foreign embassies that he deals with there, and returns 10 days later, determined. He's taken his money out of the bank, the money he's made from being a secret agent, the money he's presumably made, well, it's a pittance in pornography, and is ready to flee. And he plans for Winnie to go with him. By this time, Winnie's mother has also sacrificed her best interests and moved to an almshouse, that is to say, moved to public housing for the poor, in order to get out of Verloc's way and not be in any way, like Stevie, a burden. At any rate, Winnie listens to Verloc as he outlines his plans for their new life together. And she sits in terrible silence, listening to him. And finally, he becomes somewhat alarmed. And finally, they discuss the issue of Stevie. And Verloc wants to say, don't you see that Stevie, he didn't have any worth. He couldn't in any way fit in to the social and economic establishment in which we're operating. And I can save you from that. And so what's the problem? Winnie looks at a carving knife which has been set in place for Verloc to have a meal. Verloc loves to eat. And during this intense confrontation between the two of them, Verloc shows his own complacency by slicing a piece of beef and feeding himself, not once, but twice, in the course of Winnie's world coming apart. And finally, at the moment when he thinks he's been a little flirtatious with her, he's turned on all of what he thinks to be his charms and reflected all of his desires for her. And suddenly he looks up just for a moment and sees Winnie as she approaches him with the knife and kills him. All he can say is don't. At any rate, Winnie has achieved, if you will, to my mind, a kind of liberation that makes her, at this moment, so much greater than the world in which we have found her. She, in some sense, ignores all of its strictures, all of its laws, all of those things which have contributed to this terrible, loveless moment of Stevie's death. But immediately, she is afraid. Now, that isn't true of Clytemnestra and Tess. And what I think is most touching about Winnie is at this moment, fear of punishment, fear of being hanged for what she has done, drives her to a very mercenary moment when she recovers the money that Verloc has given to her and makes an appointment with one of the terrorists to meet him and to leave England and escape prosecution. Ossipon is the man she chooses. He is the failed medical student. You notice that the aspirations of some of the terrorists were to the professions. And so Ossipon has decided not to become a medical student and instead to become a terrorist. And he funds his life and his terrorists by seducing women and abandoning them at one point or another when it's convenient for him. When Ossipon sees what Winnie has done, he suddenly is exposed to this terrible level to which she has arisen and of which he's had absolutely no glimpse at any point in the past. He watches her as she describes what she intends. That is to say, we're going to take this money, and of course he's immediately interested in money because that's the way in which he supports himself from these women. He's apparently vaguely physically attractive, and so women fall for him, turn their funds over to him, and then he uses them and abandons them. And this is exactly what he does to Winnie. The plan is for them to depart from the railroad station to the English Channel and to move to France before Inspector Heat or any of the other legal authorities can move against them. What Ossipon does is to make sure that Winnie has her money and then jumps from the train in the London station as she goes off to the shores of the English Channel and boards a ferry. And there she recognizes, of course, what has happened. She has been once again abandoned and betrayed. And this last desperate effort to achieve some kind of relationship has failed. And so she jumps in the English Channel and drowns herself. The novel ends with the report of Winnie's death and the response of two of the characters to that death. The first responder is the professor who has provided the explosives and has also given Ossipon the tip that Winnie is available now that Stevie has died. That is to say, that he can move in there. And the other is Ossipon himself. Ossipon himself is undone by the news of Winnie's death. And he realizes suddenly that there is a level to human experience and to the human heart and to the human soul that he has never glimpsed before. Instead of repairing to still another of his female targets, he wanders in the gutter of London, baffled and terrified by what Winnie has represented to him and the realization that he is totally outside that sphere. And the final figure that we see in the novel is the professor, another person who aspired to the professions but didn't make it. The professor is the one who deals in explosives, who lives alone in terrible solitude and wires himself, as I say, so that he can blow himself up at any moment the police might try to move in on him. And they know that, and so they won't dare touch him. That seems to be his safety. And the professor dreams, at sometimes that dream is interrupted, but basically his dream is of a world where violence will have the day and where the civilization that he despises, which is all of European civilization, will blow itself sky high, and that he will somehow be the instrument of providing at least some of the explosives that will allow that to happen. And the last image we have is of the professor still dreaming his dream of this great explosion. And that dream, it seems to me, is really prophetic in that what it represents is actually going to happen 7 years after this novel was published in World War I, and the disastrous effect that that war had upon the face of Europe and the population of Europe. So the novel is indeed a dark novel. I think its greatness finally lies in Winnie's realization of what the world she is actually living in is like. She has said before that life doesn't bear much looking into, but she has had this look into life forced upon her. And for a moment at least, it is liberating and freeing. But finally, there is no escape from the world of the secret agent. There is no way out except through being blown up like Stevie, or like the world that the old the old professor envisions. So now, Susan, I'd like to see what anybody else would have to say. in the time that's left to us, and any
Okay, well,
clarification that I can make.
yeah, so thank you so much for that. I bet everybody feels like they were back in class, and I just want to be grateful we are that you have done this for us.
Well, it was great fun. I'm glad to have class again.
Well, it's fun for us. So there are a few questions. I'm going to read the first one from Emily. It says, I was struck by the nonlinear plot development in The Secret Agent. The action moved back and forth in time, and this seemed like a very modern device to her. Was it a new literary device in Conrad's time?
Well, the revelation of the murder, as it dawns on various segments of society and various characters, is I think a really dramatic feature of the novel. It is Conrad is known as a modernist, and if you think of the novels of say, for example, Virginia Woolf or E.M. Forster, you'll see that kind of shift from in time in revealing the plot is fairly characteristic. But you see how it adds to suspense because, for example, Winnie not knowing and thinking that Stevie is happy in the country with Michaelis, is a wonderful way of emphasizing the horror that she feels when the truth is revealed to her.
Thank you. We have a couple more, and I wanted to say that as we're trying it new this way with the meeting format where we can see each other and talk, if you want to say that you'd rather ask your question rather than type it, just type it over there and then I'll call on you and you can unmute and talk. And I think that might be kind of fun for all of us. Here's the next question from Beth. And she says, I know this book was chosen prior to the, whoops, it slipped away. Prior to the events that have consumed the news over the past month with the riots and the police and anarchists, she was amazed by the corollaries in the book with what we are seeing played out right now. Don't you think?
I think she's absolutely correct, and it was chosen before that, but even before the virus and even before the protests against the murders of Black people, there have been notable tensions in our society. The collapse of the Soviet Union now has restored the Putin to a position of antagonistic power in Russia. The Chinese are a threat. Just look at all the places where the social and economic order is being challenged in one way or another in the world that we face at this very moment, in this very day. And I think the real point is that Conrad, who was a very well-traveled man, he served in both the French merchant marine and the English merchant marine. And of course, he was born in Kiev and of Polish ancestry. And so he really had, as a result, a big experience of global matters. And I think his capacity to see the tensions in the society that he presents to us is a perfect place for us to turn in order to see that what we're going through at this point is nothing new. That's one of the great things I think about literature, is that we can find, if we study and pursue it diligently, we can realize that there's nothing new under the sun, that the same old issues, the same old sins, the same old limitations in our nature manifest themselves and create injustice and difficulties in the social and economic order. And Michaelis finally concludes that there is going to be this visionary society based on faith, hope, and charity. Now, obviously those are the three theological virtues upon which Christendom is supposed to have been built. But clearly what Michaelis is in some sense indicating is that this world built on faith, hope, and charity is a long, long way from ever coming into being. And that, I think, is as true today as it was in any time.
The next question is from Karen, and she says, in comparison with Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, do you think this novel works with a similar theme?
Yes, I do. I think Conrad's universe is one in which darkness and human error and human exploitation of one another is an abiding element. And so, yes, I think I can't name one of his novels that represents a world where there is much to offer to human beings, except the opportunity to display courage and moments of compassion, and that's about it. It seems to me, you know, the great projector of the world that Conrad, I think, is describing is Homer and the Iliad, and that to me is the most noble projection of a fallen world in which there is no redemption except through human compassion and sympathy. And so Conrad was, he knew Latin and Greek and so forth, so I'm assuming that he had a good knowledge of the Iliad, of the Oresteia, of Aeschylus, and of these other sources which acquaint us with this bleak and terrifying vision. I wonder if he knew King Lear. Sure he did. You know, he was Polish. He didn't speak English well until he was about 21 years old. Isn't that amazing that he became one of the great prose stylists in the tradition of the English novel?
I'm going to back up and let you know who asked those questions, because I didn't say last names in case you know them, but it's Emily Swan and Beth Phillips and Karen Kinneman. And this question is from Dave Karepka, and he says, I noticed there are a number of scenes where characters go for long walks through London while they ponder things. Any thoughts on this? I think it underscores how London is a character in the novel. Thoughts?
Well, yes, I think the great view of London is when Winnie and her mother and Stevie go in the Hansom cab to the almshouse through those streets with the poor sick horse pulling the cab, and Stevie jumps off, you remember, at one point, and is so distressed because the horse is being asked to do more than it possibly can do in its disabled state. And so the man who's driving the cab man, the handsome cab driver, is angry about Stevie and so forth. And so he tries to explain to Stevie that he's got to make a living, that he's poor, that his family depends upon him being able to exploit this horse. And Stevie is so upset by all of this, and again is just in a terrible state as a result of this drive through London. And then the wonderful description of the almshouse when they arrive there and its bleakness. Only Dickens, I think, could capture the dark side of Victorian London in the way that Conrad did. So yes, I think that that London is an emblem of the environment that poor people are faced with confronting as they move through the journey of their lives.
Next, we have a few more questions. So if you're okay with it, I'm going to keep going. But Linda Barry Weaver says, the narrator seemed like an unreliable one to me. He seemed to side with whichever character he was discussing, showing each in their best light. So that's not really a question, but what do you think about that?
Well, I think the narrator is very reliable, and that I think often his ironic assertions pass for perhaps approval when they are not in any way intended to be. I think he wants us to see all of these characters in all of their limitations. And no, I don't think he's an unreliable narrator. And the terror that arises from the novel for me depends upon his honesty and his brutal depiction of a world that he sees through ironic eyes, because he always seems aware of the possibility that it could be different, but it isn't.
Charlie also, it's not a question, but he's making a statement. One of the devices he loved was the interior monologues as expressed in the somatic expressions of the characters: sweating, frowning, trembling, slouching. He's reading Joyce at the same time, and he's intrigued with some of the similarities.
Well, that's a very good observation. And there are lots of similarities between particularly Joyce's Dublin in Ulysses and the treatment of Dublin and the London we were talking about of Verloc. But yes, I agree with that statement. I think it's a very perceptive one.
Rebecca Morrison is asking, Verloc and Heat seem to be leading parallel lives in that both are heavily invested in the status quo, but more especially disappointed in their bosses, who both seem to have little idea what they do or the circumstances within which they work. How well do college students of a traditional age respond to that in your experience?
Well, I haven't taught the novel recently, so I can't explain exactly what they might have said about that. But I certainly agree with it. Well, I guess I'm not coming up with a very good response to that, but it is true that self-interest is the controlling element in the novel, in the lives of all the characters. And so Verloc is terribly disappointed and feels unappreciated. Baron Stott Wartenheim has been his old boss and seemed to appreciate what they both did in order to maintain this delicate balance with the information that Verloc was able to supply. And now Vladimir and his associate Wurmt despise Verloc. They talk about how fat he is and how bourgeois and how absurd it is that he cares to have a marriage. You notice there's a sort of a vague homosexual response between Wurmt and Vladimir. Vladimir calls Wurmt mon cher and talks to him in French about how fat Verloc is. It's a sort of inside joke between them. And Verloc is exposed to all of this when he had anticipated a continuation of an embassy devoted to maintaining, ironically, the peace in Europe and the political stability of Europe.
Kathy Ferguson Chapman says, do you think Conrad's women characters are as richly drawn as his men? Are they more reactive than proactive?
Well, Winnie is, initially at least, very passive. Once she makes the great leap of faith to marry Verloc and to assume that she has solved the problem of dealing with Stevie. But the moment that I cited as the greatest moment in the novel is when she recognizes again that this passivity has finally been the very passivity that arranged for Stevie to go with Verloc ultimately to his death. And so to me, she and her mother are the two exceptions to the other characters who all, including the great lady, who all see that in some sense they are in charge. Winnie and her mother assume that they aren't and that they are male dependent. But then when the results register with Winnie, she acts and becomes, as I said, like Tess and Clytemnestra. She declares her freedom from the world in which she finds herself. And that is the greatest moment of victory, insofar as that there is a victory in the novel, is her capacity to recognize just how bad the world is that she and Stevie and her mother have inhabited.
Gary Rothwell is asking,
oh, Gary.
yeah, I saw some parallels with Crime and Punishment. Reluctant failed criminal central characters and the struggles of the female lower class characters to escape their circumstances at the loss of happiness. Continuing, did Conrad draw on Dostoevsky?
I'm not sure, but good for you, Gary, for recognizing those parallels, because that's true. And Dostoevsky is showing us the same kind of underbelly of the world as Conrad.
Oh, I'm so excited. Somebody is willing to ask their question, and it's Ida Zago.
Hi, Professor Reishman.
Hi.
Hi. So one of the things that I was struck by while reading this was I kept trying to figure out, like, well, what's Conrad's perspective? And in terms of politics, and I sort of couldn't figure it out. Like, what does this novel reveal about his politics? It seems like clearly capitalism is cruel, inhumane, the conditions of the poor, but then also the socialists were corrupt and ineffective and kind of fairly awful too. As you're saying, it's very dark, sort of the whole.
Well, Conrad's father, Apollo, was a dissident, and he was related to Polish aristocrats and was doing all in his power to restore the Kingdom of Poland, which at the time when he and his son lived in it was subdued by the Russian Empire. And so he was actually, in the brief time that Conrad was alive, his father and his mother both died of tuberculosis, but which was in some ways the result of poverty. But Conrad was very much in sympathy with that point of view, which his father represented, the dissident point of view. But he also seemed to see that ultimately what the professor sees at one point, he says, there are so many people marching mindlessly to the assumptions that the establishment imposes upon them, that the revolution will never really occur. And though I don't know this about Conrad, I think that must be very much his point of view. That is to say that these same flaws that have manifested themselves in one order will again manifest themselves in another. And that Michaelis, who looks forward to some vague dream of faith, hope, and charity, is just that, a fat and ineffective dreamer who can see the problems but realizes that nothing at all can be done about it.
Well, that looks like all the questions. I have received one that looks like it got sent in error, so I'm not sure who it was from. So I'm going to read this one, and if you've got any others, y'all speak up. It's a little after 5, but this person says, Dr. Reishman, Andrew Lytle taught that, as Aristotle pointed out, what gives a story unity is not, as the masses believe, that it is not about one person, but that it is about one action. What one action then is the secret agent?
The one action, I would say, is Winnie's murder of Verloc. Because that sums up, if I understand, and I think I do, Mr. Lytle's position, that one action is in some way connected to everything that precedes it and is the ultimate culmination of all of the interactions that come before it. It's interesting to me that that knife is, first of all, focused on, apparently irrelevantly, at the very beginning of the novel. And then it becomes the instrument of Winnie's great action. So that's the great action that I would say informs the novel.
All right, well, we have, trying to unmute Gary. Gary, can you unmute?
Am I there? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Dr. Reishman, I just think you might be proud of me for actually having read something before you lectured on it.
I'm very proud
that might
of
be
you.
a first.
Did you get online on time?
I managed to do that too. But
That's really super.
I had my wife help
That,
me.
as you know, is not an inherent Sewanee trait.
No, it's not. No, I'm not wearing a tie. I was just going to make a comment. You know, as I think you know, I spent a career as an investigator, and
Yes.
I was struck by the accuracy of the depiction of the police characters, both in, you know, generally how they conducted their inquiry and the networks of informants, that sort of thing, and then the following the evidence and discussing, talking to people, but the motivations, because I've seen that between, you know, egotistical investigators and how they act and how they'll undercut one another and that sort of thing. That does happen in the real world, and I thought Conrad really kind of nailed that 100 years earlier.
Gary, what about the politicians trying to take credit for what the investigators?
Yes, that too. Absolutely.
I thought that would appeal to you.
Yes, it did. It did. I mean, he just captured these motivations and how they interact within the world that I've dealt with or did deal with for 30-something years.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I found that a little bit in the Gilded Age stuff, that they were onto something.
Thank you.
And that's my big comment.
Okay, that's good.
Well,
My best to all of you, and thank you very much for this experience. And I was the machine, and I kept trying to stare at it fixedly as I'd been instructed to do, but it all worked out. And once we started talking about the novel and Conrad absorbed me, I didn't find it too much different from talking to you in the way we used to before COVID-19. So thank you. Thank you, Susan, for arranging it. And
oh, thank you. You always say yes so much and to help me, and I just appreciate it so much. And it's just like riding a bike again. You just were back in the saddle. And
goodbye to all of you, and thank you again for tuning in. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
John, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.